Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 84 of the Citrix session. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got a good group with me today, as always, more or less. I've got Bill Sutton. Bill, how's it going?
Going well, Andy. How about yourself?
Good. How was the weekend?
Oh, it was fine. Family and cutting the grass and all that good stuff. My 13-year-old was visiting his grandparents, so I had to cut the backyard for the first time in probably over a year. So,
my son went off to college, and I cut the grass for the first time in like 3 or 4 years. Came inside and told my wife I was ready to move to a condo.
yeah, I said almost exactly the same thing, except we'd have to buy like 3 storage units to store all the junk we have in the attic. So,
That means it's just time to clean up.
That's right. That's right.
Speaking of cleaning up, we're going to talk about cloud versus on premises here in a minute. And I think that's a big part of moving to the cloud is an opportunity to clean up, and you kind of forces you to, because you can't take that junk with you to a condo. You can't take that junk with you to the cloud. How about that transition?
That's right. Yeah.
Nice.
Perfect.
This stuff.
We didn't plan that either.
Jon Spallone, how's it going, John?
It's going good. How about you, Andy? Well,
Good.
never mind. I already heard it. So,
No, look, it's going great. I find myself Sunday afternoon struggling because I feel like I didn't get everything out of the weekend I wanted. Also, I feel like I can't wait to go to work on Monday morning. It's a weird thing I run through every weekend.
I definitely hear you on that.
Ben Rogers, I see you there in the basement. They won't let you up, will they?
Well, my child just went back to school, so I am going to start migrating myself back up. But today, all the toys are downstairs. So probably over the next couple of days, I'll start transitioning to the upstairs office where I can sit and relax without my child bombarding me with 5,000 questions as he did over the summer.
Yeah, I can relate. Yeah, you're in Mecklenburg County schools, or no?
No, I'm in Union County. I live in Waxhaw, North Carolina. So, man, they all started back today. The traffic jam's going to be great here in about 2 hours when I got to go pick him up.
I wondered about that earlier over the weekend with school starting back here in the big, massive county I'm in. With the pandemic and school happening for the first time literally in a year and a half, are we back to traffic madness? I think we probably are, but we'll see.
Well, we've been that way in the DC area for a while.
Yeah. Even
Forever.
with the pandemic and the kids staying home. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Well, and here's the question. Is the madness going to be during morning rush hour, or is it going to be at lunchtime when all the stay-home workers are trying to go out and get lunch and pick up kids from school? Is that when we're going to see it now? In the suburbs, not the city, but the suburbs.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. Today was pretty, now granted it's the first day of school. You got new parents that really don't know how to get through the traffic line. You got old parents like me that are like, okay, you got to have them ready to drop, man. Door comes open, you're out the door. Go, 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 go. So hopefully by the end of the week, we'll get the process down and it'll be smoother than it was this morning. But this morning was just head in hand going, oh, help me get through this, Lord.
Yeah. They should dress up the carpool people with and bus drivers and everything like a NASCAR uniform, just to encourage them to make it like a pit stop. Well, guys, we were chit-chatting before we picked the blog for today about gateway service, whether it should be used or whether we should be having people consider using on-premises gateways in addition to cloud services and orchestrating and integrating all those. And it kind of led us to this blog around building enterprise resilience lessons learned from 2019, which I think a lot of people, unfortunately, just jumped in and started using VPNs. But a lot of people that were somewhere on the spectrum of using Citrix had to figure out whether to double down, and if so, how to do it. And I think that's what this blog is really talking about: how to create that workflow and resiliency all at the same time under the gun, and what we learned from it. I guess I'll start with Ben on the Citrix side. Ben, is that something you had a lot of customers come to you and try to figure out real time?
Well, so for me, the pandemic was right when I started with Citrix. So, my personal interfacing with customers, I wasn't there yet. And so I didn't get the experience of being able to see customers have to react. I was still in that, new employee training cycle. What has been interesting to me, though, is to see how they've come out of the pandemic and how they've thought about their digital infrastructure. And the fact that I don't think anybody on this call would deny that, man, the pandemic accelerated cloud adoption. And I think some companies are really looking at, now that the smoke kind of settled. It looks like it's starting, the dust kind of settled. It looks like it might be brewing up again. But a lot of companies were asking themselves, we know cloud is coming. We know we're going to have to make a move to the cloud, but how do we do that? And in healthcare specifically, those organizations are still left with, how do we keep our on-prem environment running until we can do this transformation? Or what does this transformation even look like? So I see a lot of people that are on the other side of the pandemic going, what do we need to do to shore ourselves up for whatever the future brings, whether it brings another pandemic, acceleration of business, expansion, consolidation. Those are a lot of the conversations that I'm having is, where am I at today and where do I need to be tomorrow?
So, Jon, you were at Citrix during most of this as an employee. Were you insulated from these reactions from customers, or were you part of the front line?
Yeah. So from my experience, though, really, it's with the customers. It's not much of that direct interaction, but it was more of advisory. Was more of making sure people understood things, understood the value, and really it comes from my experience. I mean, I've been a remote worker probably, better part of 10, 15 years now. So it's really, there's an echo somewhere in my ear.
Yeah, I'm going to go on mute, see what happens on my end, but it started when you started speaking.
Okay. Is that better or worse? Yes? I don't hear it anymore. Okay. So really, from my experience, it comes from applying how I've worked for this long and helping people understand that. But yeah, I was very isolated from direct interaction, but more of just advisory to those out there of what they're looking for and where they're going to. And I think one of the key topics we're looking at here too with this blog is understanding those. Give you an example, when the dam broke in California years ago, the FEMA response, building out environments to support those. Here in Maryland, Ellicott City, we had the floods. We had to build out environments quickly to support government teams going in to assess and support and do their jobs, and influxing technology very quickly to support those loads that wasn't there before. And what it seems like we're hitting here is, because of COVID, there's so many solutions that got thrown out real quick. And now that we're starting to come back to reality and come back to an understanding of where we kind of were beforehand, is how do we balance this capability that we gave people during the pandemic, as well as services that we provided beforehand? How do we join those together to give that resilient environment for the workers?
Well, and before I transition over to Bill, I'm going to read a statement on the screen here from the sharing of the blog. It says, by contrast, digital resiliency can be defined as the ability of the enterprise to not only restore essential business capabilities, but also capitalize on the changed conditions to bounce back even faster, better, stronger. I think I've run into a few customers, at least, that were going to go back to the way things were pre-pandemic, and they're not leveraging that bounce that they could have and should have gotten. I wonder if it's because of success during it or lack of success during the transition. The next statement talks about 70% of organizations had to come up with some kind of acceleration of their digital transformation because of the pandemic. Bill, have you seen any customers that have actually gone back the other way as quickly as they could?
Yes. I have a real good friend who works for one. I won't name the company or the location, but this company was not prepared for the pandemic. They did not allow remote work, even for programming and so forth. So when the pandemic occurred and the governor said, you've got to send people home, they can't be in proximity to one another, they struggled to enable remote work through VPN technology, which of course, as we all know, has its limits. And in this case, it caused a lot of problems. So as soon as they were allowed to bring people back, they brought all their people back. And what they have found is about 30% is what I've been reading. About 30% of the workers have either resigned or threatened to resign if they have to go back to work full time. Some of that I think is just personal preference, but some of it, quite frankly, I think is folks concerned about getting sick. So I think what we're going to see in other companies that are perhaps more progressive is a blend, a hybrid, like Jon was alluding to, in the sense that they're gonna maybe it's 3 days a week in the office and 2 at home, or the other way around. And the advancement of the tools that they put in place for the pandemic are going to expand even further with the use of remoting technologies like what we all sell and support, as well as cloud.
Yeah. So, Bill, you're really talking without even realizing you're doing it about the human element, which is pointed out in the blog, that human element around hybrid work is conducive of what they want, what they need, and what society is telling us we have to do for now.
Yeah, I mean, this historically it's all been, well, work from home, but it's really work from anywhere. I mean, I work from home. I have since I joined XenTegra for the most part. But right around the corner from me is one of those work sharing places that I'm sure we're all familiar with, and I could easily go there and work around other people. I haven't chosen to do that, but and I could work from a Starbucks. So that resiliency, making that connection resilient and available to the user, allows them to be able to work from anywhere, not just home.
Well, let's use this blog to get back to where we started the conversation before we hit record, which is, from a technology perspective, how do you solve that? And we kind of came to the realization that it's cloud and IT as a service type stuff. But at what point have you over-rotated? Bill, Ben, using your conversation specifically, you were talking about Citrix Gateway as a service, which is a cloud technology, which leverages, the ability to have a central point where both ICA is coming and going to. It's kind of there in the middle, which really shows off the power of the ICA protocol and its lightweight efficiency. But is that the right answer for some organizations versus keeping gateways on premises with maybe a failover to a cloud gateway service? You sound like you've worked with a couple of customers recently where this has become a topic.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the question that's always being asked when we're talking to customers and we're doing design aspect is, how close can you get the connections to the actual VDAs? Historically, that's been using an ADC. So your ADCs in the same facility or it's close to the VDAs as it can get. There's not a lot between it and the ADC. With the cloud gateway service, you're putting much more between it and the actual VDA. You've got the cloud connector. I realize we have the rendezvous protocol that can, kind of get around the cloud connector, but who knows how many hops you might be hitting to go from the cloud gateway to the VDA. And so that's just where I started out the conversation with you guys is I'm not very good with the rendezvous protocol. I know that brings some enhancement to the gateway service, but is there a better way to do it without using the ADCs? And that's where, I'm not making a statement as a Citrix employee. I'm a technician that works in the Citrix environment, works in the cloud environment, and I'm wondering what is the best way for us to achieve that?
Well, I keep touting the ability of the ICA protocol to, even with extra latency, work pretty well. XenTegra is a real world use case where we used to have our ADCs and our VDAs in the same place, our gateways and our desktops in the same place. I'll just, John wasn't around during that time. He is now with a virtual desktop using the gateway service. Bill, when we moved our virtual desktops and started using gateway service, but the VDAs stayed in our data center in Atlanta, did you notice any end user difference?
Actually, it was better.
Well, and I thought it was better too. And I don't know if it was just mental or what, but Ben, it's kind of like logic would tell you it has to be better, even without rendezvous protocol. I mean, it has to be worse, but it ended up being the same or better or unnoticeable. I fought it, and then what happened, and I didn't notice a difference. So maybe it's a moot point.
I don't know. I know that we've got a particular issue that we're dealing with where we're having to go back and say, hey, to build a better reliant environment, we need to bring some infrastructure back on site. And so that's kind of what got me thinking about this, is when do you use an ADC and when do you use a cloud gateway? And I don't have the answer to it. That's why I posed it to this group here, but it's real interesting to hear your personal experience with it and also experiences that we've also seen in the field.
Hey, Ben, can you shed any more light into why in this particular case it's looking like maybe going back to gateways on premises makes sense?
Well, unfortunately, this customer experienced a cloud outage, and the cloud outage, came at the worst time it could. It was right at the beginning of the day when people were getting logged in, and so they couldn't get authenticated. And when they couldn't get authenticated, they couldn't do anything. So they go, hey, we think this cloud service is a wonderful thing. It's done a lot good for us, but when it's not available, it's not a good thing. And so that's where we've had to come back, and say, okay, maybe we need to build some on-prem infrastructure to guard against that. And of course, I don't blame the customer for raising an eyebrow and going, well, that's kind of goes against the cloud motto. And, cloud has gotten much better, but no technology is perfect.
Did you look at the customer and say, well, I guess your environment's never gone down, right? I know you can't say that. Question for you. And I want to turn this over to John. Was it?
Well, John did make. I want to add something. Not to interrupt you, Andy, but John did make a comment early on in our conversation before we started recording. Is, a lot of these questions come down to: are you on premise? Do you still have infrastructure that's in your four walls, or have you gotten that out into a service? Are you in an Azure? Are you in a third-party data center? Are you somewhere where it's not your infrastructure anymore? And I thought that was an interesting comment because at first it didn't land on me how pointed that was, but as I thought about it, that does go into play of, what's between where your users connect and where they're needing to go to. And I think that does have a lot to do with the design of a solution.
So John, put on your technical architect hat for a minute and then address this conversation. And then I challenge you to put on your business guy hat and address the same thing. I'll be curious to see if you address it exactly the same way. Go ahead with the the technical architect hat, and how would you tell in general a customer to proceed here?
Cloud versus a hybrid versus all on-prem.
Well, I think hybrid is the easy way out, right? Oh, hybrid.
Yeah.
What's that mean? Well, you do a little of this, a little of that. Depends on them. That's like the consultant answer of it depends. If you had a customer in Ben's situation where they were worried about outages and they still had local VDAs for either desktops or apps, what's your default answer to trying to solve that problem technically?
So technically, if that's the case, then there's either going to be some failover from the cloud services to an on-prem, or the on-prem is primary with a failover to the cloud. But really, once you're locking in those VDAs that are down local in your data center, you're going to want that high availability coming out of the data center. Because that's the other thing that a lot of people don't think about is that cloud itself may go out. We may have these infrastructure hits. We may have a customer that changes network settings that bring things down at the provider level, but you also have to take into consideration your connectivity, where your user is coming out from it at home or within the home office or whatever. So that's where you want to make sure that do you have that high availability from your user's origination point. Yeah. So definitely, if I'm living on-prem with VDAs and I want my high availability at that on-prem location with failover into the cloud or a data center.
So John, a couple of questions for you on that. First of all, let's do this for the group, and I'll go around the horn here. Bill, at what point does round trip latency become an issue for the average user using the ICA protocol?
300 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds, somewhere in that neighborhood. Round
trip, 3 to 5. That's when they start to notice.
Well, they'll notice at 300, but they'll definitely notice at 500. That's what I've seen. You're talking about ICA round trip or RT or okay, yeah.
ICA round trip. At what point does it become a little laggy feeling where you don't realize you're not local?
250.
250. John?
Yeah, exactly what Bill said.
250. Ben?
I'm no idiot. I'm going to agree with the experts.
Well, thanks for agreeing with me, Ben. I think it's about 80, but I think the studies show about 250. But as an end user, I start to notice, I feel like and maybe I'm a little bit critical, I start to notice about 80 to 100, I think, or at least I fool myself into being smarter than I am and think 80 to 100. But I think it's very usable up to the 200 range that Bill and John alluded to.
So what's the first thing that draws your attention to it starting to degrade?
Honestly, in today's world, when you're moving around and you're seeing animated stuff, it either looks fuzzy, which I did the same thing on my TV last night. I changed internet providers and I had to move some hotspots around, access points around. I start to notice fuzziness. or I start to see a little lag or framey type of animations.
So that's because you're spending all that time watching videos. I notice it in typing latency, typing an email or typing into Salesforce.
Yeah.
You start typing and you see you're like 5 letters ahead of where the screen is. That's where I start to see it.
Yeah.
See, I'll start to notice it in Salesforce where going between accounts, you're switching between accounts, the lag going between accounts is when I'll start to notice it.
Yeah. And keep in mind, you're talking to somebody who's literally got a full-time ping test going as they're flying. And I'm complaining to the flight attendant about how bad I don't do that anymore. In fact, I guess I never did, but people do. I'm like, I'm just lucky to be using this stuff, but using my virtual desktop in the air becomes sometimes amazing and sometimes challenging. Jon, your take on this next section around enterprise resiliency.
Let's see the enterprise part. Where are we at there? Okay, we're so prior to cloud. Okay, so really, what I was looking at. Let me get back in there. So I think it really comes down to that. Sorry, Andy, you caught me off guard there for a minute. I was looking at the wrong section. It comes down to that business itself as far as security, the trust of the users and the user data as far as what's being stored in there. And I'd even go as far as the customer data. I mean, when we see all these things being compromised today, ransomwares or any type of data that's being pulled out, that's where we've got to make sure we've got that balance of with these integrated technologies that we've had to deploy out for COVID, with this new direction of focus that we're looking at coming out of the tunnel of COVID, where does that security lie? Where do we need to tweak and enhance? I really kind of look at everything that we've went through has been a big technology learning for enterprises, for all technology business side of the house, that eventually we'll get that best practice. I know, Ben, you brought up about some comments, what's best. I don't think that you can pinpoint a white paper of this is the best optimal deployment for a resilient environment. These are the top solutions that need to integrate for that. I think it starts to fan out to a catalog of solutions with that resiliency.
One thing I think that is a little bit addressed here, what they're talking about is I've gotten environments where you've got a primary data center and then you've got a secondary data center, but that secondary data center didn't get built with best practice. And sometimes you find those things out on the back end. So one thing, like with us at Citrix, when we're building our Azure environment, no 3389, they want you to kit that right off the bat. But when you go through a standard build in Azure, it puts 3389 in there. Well, if you're not paying attention to that, you could have VMs out there that have 3389 open. And so when I think of, resiliency means enterprise security, you got to make sure wherever and I'm going to use Citrix terms here, wherever your resource locations are they optimally secured? And is the security in those resource locations the same to where you don't have to worry about attacks in one facility that was built in a hurry, or they might not have the same security practice because it doesn't have the same eyes on it. So that's one thing I think that this kind of goes into is, you got to have a security plan that includes all of the combination of things that could be going on-prem, cloud, third-party data center. Are both data centers or tri-data centers at equal security values? Or is there something done different in one that's not being done in the other that creates a vulnerability if an attacker got in and was able to get to either one?
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And you think about a lot of these solutions that were thrown up there, Zoom as an example. How often do we hear about organizations now moving to Zoom for meetings and conferences, data, chats? That's something that an organization hadn't done before. There's data that's within Zoom, that's a different provider of a service. Did that adhere to those securities that were in place beforehand? And if it didn't, because we used the technology to get us through it, how do we now go back and address those things? So that's a lot of what organizations need to look at today. And I think they're now being able to take a look and kind of breathe a little bit to say, okay, how do we reapply how we did business before to the way we're doing business today?
So I kind of screwed up a little while ago. I didn't ask Jon to answer the architect question with his business hat on, because he might have answered it differently, but I'll bring it back here to point out that the fact that when it comes to security, the architect and the business guy often start to blend together, as to the point where we can't have a production data center and then a secondary data center that's halfway done. When it comes to security, it's all got to be done right. And all of a sudden the need to blend a as a service approach where that's taken care of by somebody else, and real world needs all of a sudden maybe start to align, or would you think that they become further apart?
I think they start to align.
Yeah.
Bill, as a guy who's leading teams doing this stuff, does that logic make sense, or are we still living in a world where everybody gets through it, halfway does one side of the equation, and then says they'll come back to the other side?
We still have people that are halfway doing it and say they'll come to the other side. But what we have run into more than once, in fact, very recently, is customers who want GSLB set up, or they want high availability set up between data centers, but there's nothing in the secondary data center except maybe a VMware environment or a Xen server environment. So I want to fail over to my Citrix environment in my DR facility, and that's great. What else is there? Well, we'll get Exchange moved, or we'll get our vertical apps moved over in our file shares. We just want to be able to present a Citrix desktop. So in a DR scenario, in that example, they'll get a desktop, but won't really be able to do much with it. So we've run into that. I've run into that as much as 10 years ago with customers wanting DR, but there was nothing there. And then there's the flip side, which is investment firms that are required to have a fully functional DR facility outside of their home zip code. This was post 9/11, and we had a customer that literally had a warehouse that they had old workstations set up. They were using Citrix VDI. They had old workstations set up, each one with a flag that said, resolution, accounting, finance, credit checks, all these things. And if they had a DR situation, they literally everybody had to pick up and go to that facility and do what they needed to do. I imagine today, most of them will probably go home and work in a cloud environment.
Well, and that's what this whole article is about. The pandemic forced that to happen, and all of a sudden, some of those bunch of old workstations at a remote location concepts, that wasn't going to work in this scenario.
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't have, because people would have been together. They'd have to go to a third location or to go home typically.
And that kind of gets us down to this last section here, where it talks about the uncertainty of what is coming is the certainty that we got to get better at the way we've been doing it, in that way of the idea of just, we'll get to it later. It can't be that way.
Hey, Bill, I've got a question for you. How many times have you gone through a customer's DR plan for them to realize it wasn't really a DR plan?
Not that much. Usually that comes up. We'll ask the question and they'll say, I have a DR plan. And if they start asking for us to help build DR, then we may look at it. But we don't typically, the SEs, Jon and some of the other guys may be looking at that. But when it comes to an implementation side, we're focused on implementing what they've scoped out for us. So not oftentimes we'll find it out. We might find out, hey, you don't have anything in DR, because they told the SE, well, we're in the process of building that. But in fact, that process might be 18 months, 24 months down the road. Makes little sense to build a failover location for something that doesn't exist today.
Yeah, I've had a couple of incidences where you're talking to the customer and they say they got DR, and you go, okay, explain to me, if you went down today, what would you do? What's your run books? What I've heard it referred to as. Yep. And it's amazed me how many customers kind of go, well, we don't really have a run book. And then you start going, okay, well, let's just, let's play this out. Let's role play it. And then as they're role playing it in their mind, they realize that they don't have a run book and they don't have a method of, getting restored quickly. And I think that's one of the things, Andy, you had pointed out something, that part of this article is how quick can you get back to where you were? And that's something that when I start talking to customers, I try to make that a point of, have you, one, do you have a run book? And if you do have a run book, does the employees know that run book exists? Do your team know that? Have they exercised this run book? Have they actually battle card this? And so it's interesting to me how many customers don't have that, but yet they'll state they have a DR plan. So you're probably seeing much more of this than I am, but I have run into that a few times.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of customers that I've worked with in the past as well as currently that they just don't have the idea of what's going on. They have the capabilities. They have, all the business end as far as, the things you would need, resources and licensing. It's all on hand. So it's not really a matter of can they afford to do it? They can do it. But they just don't understand it. It's, I've got that secondary site. What am I going to do with it? Am I running hot, cold? Am I running hot? Where they can have those capabilities to do that. How am I failing over? A lot of environments, it's all manual. When there's automation, it's in play. I know you want to not take the hands completely off the wheel, but a lot of the hands-on control that a lot of admins do today, that it doesn't need to be there. But, I see you're highlighting here on this, Andy. I mean, I love that last sentence. I mean, that last sentence sums it up 100%.
Yeah.
Question for you guys in that conversation around DR, were you talking about DR or were you talking about business continuity, or were you kind of talking them together?
So some of them with from my examples, we weren't even discussing DR. They were discussing taking their solution to a next level, upgrades, what they do, and then within discovery, finding out that secondary site and not even being applied. And that's where you kind of like, do we want to talk about this first and have that conversation? And some people are open to that and receptive and say, hey, that does change my thought process on how it goes. And am I doing DR? Am I doing pandemic? Am I doing, redundant sites? Some of them, it's just this, hey, this last sentence, business as usual. We'll just keep on going and we'll catch up on this later on as we go along.
Well, and I think minus the as usual piece or the oxymoron part that's in here, I think the answer to DR and business continuity and cloud services has to be business as usual, and all that stuff just becomes a moot point because it's happening. It's all resilient all the time. And cloud services is what's making it so where you can make that statement because that app you depend on is no longer your problem. It's Microsoft's problem. It's Google's problem. It's SAP's problem. You're just a subscriber to it as a service from potentially an app or some type of workspace, aka a desktop or some type of digital workspace. And that's going to fix a lot of problems for companies that they may or may not have known they had, but it's going to fix it no matter what, or at least going to shift their blame. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, as you can see in my video, I've got an assistant who's shown up. I need to help them a little bit. But this has been great. And these types of conversations are always fun, entertaining, and relevant.
Yeah, I would agree. I wanted to add one last thing real quick here, and that is for Ben's benefit. I think, Ben, you asked a question about gateway service on-prem in the cloud. I don't know if you've had the opportunity yet or seen these other things that have been added recently, direct workload connection and service continuity. Those might help this customer implementing some of those things or leveraging those in addition to the rendezvous protocol. Those might help your argument if you haven't already looked at them.
Yeah, I've got to come up on the rendezvous protocol. That was talked about in one of our department meetings. And
right.
Yeah, man, I thought it was neat that we could bypass the cloud connector, but of course I'm sitting there going, how many things are between the cloud connector and the VDA? But yeah, I've got some legwork. That's the one great thing about being part of this podcast and working with companies like XenTegra and Citrix that, man, it's never ending, dude. There's always something to learn, always a saw to sharpen. And Andy, man, I appreciate you having me part of the podcast. And I also appreciate you bringing the talent that you do to make this thing fun and educational. I get some benefit out of it. I have to assume our listeners are doing the same as I am.
Yeah, that's the idea behind the partnership, right? And making sure that we both are talking and working together for the better good of the customer base. And I'm a little prideful of it, but we do a heck of a good job of it. Working with you guys. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate the time, and enjoy the rest of your Monday.
You too.
You too, Andy. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good one.